Good day, one and all. Welcome to the seventh lecture for the course I-306 Supply Chain and Logistics Management. I am Matthew Baby, Assistant Professor with the Department of Mechanical Engineering at Rajagiri School of Engineering and Technology. In this lecture, we will be dealing with the very first two steps involved in achieving strategic fit. Now, this will be the part 2 lecture on the topic achieving strategic fit and will be a continuation from lecture number 6. So, as we have discussed in the previous lecture, the very first step towards achieving strategic fit is understanding the customer segment, their needs, and the level of uncertainty faced by the supply chain. So, to start off with, we start by identifying the needs of the customer segments that are being served. So, a particular product that is being sold by a particular organization may be targeted at more than one customer segment. Okay, so there will be a set of people for which a particular product or service is tailored towards. So we start out by identifying the needs of the customer segments that are being served by the product or service that the company is selling. Take for example the case of high-end retailers like branded clothing stores. Okay, so in those kinds of stores, the customers of those kinds of branded clothing stores, they prioritize quality, features, availability, and variety over cost. So cost is not of major concern to them. What is important for them is quality, features, availability, variety, etc. So if you are a company, or if a company is dealing with high-end retailing, where they deal with branded clothing stores, for example, then they should give importance to customer priority like quality, features, availability, and variety, and not cost. Whereas if you're dealing with thrift stores, for example, local clothing stores, the customers that visit those kinds of stores, their priority is low cost at reasonable levels of quality. Okay, so we start off by identifying the needs of the customer segments that are being served by the organization or the company. Now, these customer priority, the customer demand, they vary along various attributes. Some of the common attributes along which these customer demands vary are listed out over here. These are quite straightforward. So, for example, the customer demand vary in terms of quantity of products needed. For example, if an organization is involved in procuring parts for an emergency repair, okay, so emergency order for repair, generally the quantity of order is low, okay, whereas if the product has been acquired for a new construction, okay, constructing or setting up a new production line itself, then the quantity of order generally is larger. So customer demands vary in terms of quantity of products needed. They vary in terms of response time that the customer is willing to tolerate. Okay, for example, if the requirement is an emergency requirement, then the customer's willingness to tolerate high response times is low. So low tolerance to response times is generally characterized for products which are of emergency nature. Okay. Another attribute along which customer demand vary is basically variety of products needed. Okay, so some customers, they require all their requirements to be met from one location or place. So they go to places where all their requirements are met at one go. So they are looking for convenience. Okay, so customer demand varies along in terms of quantity of products required, the response time that the customer is willing to tolerate, the variety of products needed, the service level required. Okay, that means customers, they vary in terms of uh, how far they prioritize product availability. Okay, so this product availability is especially true in the case of or should be very high in the case of emergency orders. If a customer is going into a store looking for a particular product that he requires immediately, then product availability is very important. Okay, so service level required is basically an indicator of product availability at the time of requirement. Okay, then another attribute along which customer demand varies in terms of price. Okay, So for emergency orders, the customers are less sensitive to price. Whereas if we are dealing with an order that can wait for a long time, there the customers tend to become more choosy. Okay, so if response time is basically very low for a customer and the requirement is basically an emergency requirement, then price becomes a less relevant factor. Okay, then the last factor along which customer attributes vary, customer demand vary, is basically desired rate of innovation. So for customers who generally visit high-end stores, those kinds of customers demand for higher levels of innovation in the products that they seek to buy. So customers of high-end stores, they expect new features in their products. For them, that is what is of concern. So the customer demands of the set of customers who we are going to satisfy needs for, their needs itself can vary based upon different attributes. So once again, these attributes are quantity, response time, variety of products needed, the required level of service, the price, and the desired rate of innovation. So to understand how the supply chain is affected by the demand of the customer, okay, or to understand the level of uncertainty that is imposed upon the supply chain by the nature of demand of the customer, it is essential that we combine all the above attributes along which customer needs may vary. So customer needs vary along the previously mentioned attributes. So all customers might not have the same need because their needs vary along different attributes. So it is very essential that we combine all the above attributes so that we can combine and find a single key measure, okay, that will help us determine what the supply chain uncertainty will look like. And this will help us determine what the supply chain needs to do particularly well. So ascertaining the level of uncertainty that is faced by a supply chain can be done by combining the attributes along which customer needs vary into one key measure. Okay, and once this is done, you'll be able to ascertain what will be the level of uncertainty, and it is based upon the level of uncertainty that we determine what the supply chain needs to do particularly well, whether it needs to be highly responsive or whether it should be tailored towards being more efficient. So this one key metric or key measure that combines all the attributes is termed as implied demand uncertainty. Okay, so implied demand uncertainty means it generally indicates the demand uncertainty that is imposed upon the supply chain because of the customer needs that it seeks to satisfy. Okay, so a particular product may be sold to different customer segments, and a particular firm might be selling that particular product only to a particular segment. So if, for example, product X, okay, it is used by market segments or customer segments A, B, C, and D. Okay, each of these market segments having different demand characteristics because they have different demand attributes. Okay, so they vary in terms of price requirements, service level required, etc. Okay, so there might be variations among all these market segments or customer segments. So product A or product X is distributed or it is sold to four different customer segments A, B, C, and D. That's the case we are taking. So a firm, say ABC, a firm by the name ABC would like to sell that particular product only to customers in the in the market segment A and B, for having a particular set of traits. So the demand uncertainty that is faced by the firm ABC is not the demand uncertainty that is faced by the entire product X, because the entire product X is targeted at sales across the different segments A, B, C, and D. Okay, so since the firm ABC is targeting only segments A and B with the product X, then the demand uncertainty that is imposed upon that particular supply chain of the firm ABC because of its target customers, okay, they and their needs. So their target customers belong to segments A and B, and the needs of that particular segment is what is being satisfied. So the demand uncertainty imposed on the supply chain is not the demand uncertainty that is imposed upon the supply chain due to the uncertainty in the entire product's demand. Okay, so the implied uncertainty is basically the demand uncertainty that is imposed on the supply chain because of the customer needs that it seeks to satisfy. And the implied demand uncertainty will surely be affected by two major factors. One is the set of customer needs that the supply chain seeks to satisfy. Okay, whichever is a set of market segments or customer segments that the supply chain or the firm seeks to satisfy, their customer, that particular segment's customers need is one major factor that affects implied demand uncertainty. Okay, and the second factor is the product demand uncertainty. The entire product as such will have certain demand uncertainty. Okay, so if the product demand uncertainty is high, then larger will be the implied demand uncertainty. Okay, so we'll have a comparison between what is demand uncertainty and implied demand uncertainty. By the term demand uncertainty, we mean uncertainty of customer demand for an entire product. Okay, whereas implied demand uncertainty is nothing but the resulting uncertainty for the portion of the demand that the supply chain plans to satisfy based upon the attributes of the customer desires. Okay, so a particular product, as I told you, may be sold to different customer segments. Okay, a portion of that particular demand is basically met by delivering it to a particular segment. So the resulting uncertainty for the portion of the demand of the supply chain, a particular supply chain, seeks or plans to satisfy based upon the attributes of the customer desire. That particular part of the uncertainty, the resulting uncertainty from the portion of the demand that the supply chain is planning to satisfy, that is basically what we refer to as implied demand uncertainty. So implied demand uncertainty is nothing but a part of the demand uncertainty. Okay, so to understand this particular difference between these two terms, there is an example that is given over here where a firm supplying emergency orders of a particular product. Okay, whereas we come across another firm supplying the same product, but this time the order is not of emergency need. Okay, so for the same product we come across two firms. Okay, one firm that is dedicated to serving emergency orders and another firm which does not take any emergency orders. So it takes only orders where they have plenty of time to deliver the order. So that is what we mean by longer lead times. So we come across two different firms that deliver the same product, but one serving customers with emergency order needs, another serving customers with longer lead time requirements. Okay, so for the firm that is supplying emergency orders, due to the short time in which they have to respond to that particular order, okay, they generally have to make sure that they have the required product in stock and they have to deliver it as quickly as possible. So therefore the supply chain as a whole has to be prepared, okay, for any emergency order in any quantity requirements. That is why such a kind of supply chain, okay, that is structured by a firm that is tailored towards meeting emergency orders will have higher implied demand uncertainty. We are not talking about demand uncertainty, but it is basically due to the nature of demand requirements. Okay, this particular firm supplies the same product as another firm, but they are dealing with customers whose nature of order is basically different from that other firm. Okay, and this particular nature where orders are to be delivered, okay, quickly upon receipt of order, that basically puts higher levels of demand uncertainty, implied demand uncertainty on the firm. Okay, whereas the firm supplying the same product with longer lead times will only face lower implied demand uncertainty because they have plenty of time to prepare for that particular order. Okay, once an order comes in, they have plenty of time. They have longer lead times when compared to emergency orders. So in for both these cases, since they are dealing with the same product, the demand uncertainty for the product is the same. Okay, so since the product is the same, the level of uncertainty in demand for the product, it remains the same. But for firms that deal with only a specific kind of order, okay, based upon the portion of the demand for that particular product that a particular firm is trying to satisfy, based upon that the implied demand uncertainty will vary. So and in general, implied demand uncertainty is basically the uncertainty that results from the portion of the demand that the supply chains plans to satisfy based upon their target market, okay, their customers, based upon the attributes of their customers demand. The uncertainty that results from this portion of the demand that the supply chain or the firm seeks to satisfy is what we term as implied demand uncertainty. Okay, so I hope you understand, or you are able to understand the difference between demand uncertainty and implied demand uncertainty. So there is a clear correlation between the demand, certain demand characteristics, and the level of implied demand uncertainty. So this is easily understood by this particular table, which shows the different demand characteristics along the along the rows, different rows. So the row headings like product margin, average forecast error, average stock out rate, average forced season end markdowns, they are all demand characteristics. Okay, whereas you see along the columns the headings low implied demand uncertainty and high implied demand uncertainty, which indicates the levels of implied demand uncertainty. So if a particular product has low margin, by margin I mean the profit earned by selling the products. Okay, so if I'm talking about unit product margin, I'm talking about the profit earned by selling a single unit of product. So if the product margin in general is low, by margin I mean the difference between the selling price and the cost. Okay, so lower the difference between that selling price and the cost involved in manufacturing the product or delivering the product to the customer, lower is the margin. So for products with low margin, okay, you see that the implied demand uncertainty is generally low because you are dealing with whenever product margins are low, the general nature of the market is basically a competitive one, and competitive markets only evolve towards the later stage of product lives. Okay, so as a product is first introduced into the market, generally the number of competitors in the market are generally very low. That means you can generally have a high margin. Okay, and but high margin is generally, as I told you, uh, basically placed upon a product during the initial stages of its life cycle because the competition is low. So hence you can price the particular product at a slightly higher premium because you don't have any competitors during this early stage. Okay, but at the same time, since a product is newly launched in the market, the demand is also demand uncertainty is also high. Okay, that is why the implied demand uncertainty when the product margin is high is basically high. Whereas as a product matures and it goes into the later stages of its life cycle, number of competitors increase. Therefore, the manufacturer or firm will be forced to reduce their prices. Okay, that means reduction in the product margin. Okay, due to increased competition, and this basically is basically towards the latter end of its life cycle. And once we are into the later stages of life cycle, demand becomes much more certain. Therefore, the implied demand uncertainty will be low. So wherever you see the case of products having low margin, generally the implied demand uncertainty will be low. Whereas in cases where the product margin is high, they generally indicate high implied demand uncertainty. Okay. Similarly is the case with average forecast error. So, okay, in the case of products having low implied demand uncertainty, the average forecast error in forecast is generally around 10%, whereas in high implied demand uncertainty cases, the forecast errors will be higher, okay, generally somewhere in the range of 40 to 100%. Okay, similarly, the average stock out rate means the possibility of a particular product not being available at a time of order. Okay, so wherever the implied demand uncertainty is low, that means the demand is much more certain. The chances of you going out of stock is generally low. Okay, similarly, whereas in the case of high implied demand uncertainty, the stock out rates will be high because your prediction of what the demand is, okay, might be off by a large factor. Therefore, you stock items generally in you might end up stocking items in lower quantities than what is actually required. So this might result in higher chances of stocking out as high as 10 to 40%. Okay, and the last factor is in terms of average forced season and markdowns. In the case of products which are a failure, okay, that means they do not sell as per the forecasted number. At the very end of the season, to reduce the overall cost, you might be forced to offer discounts on the product and then force sales. So if the implied demand uncertainty is generally low, that means your forecasted demands are much more accurate. The chance of your products not being sold is less. So the chance of you having to mark down at the end of the season is generally low. It is almost nil in the case of low implied demand uncertainty. Whereas in the case of high implied demand uncertainty, the chances of you having a firm, particularly a firm having to uh, give a price markdown at the end of the season is generally higher. It is somewhere in the range of 10 to 25%. So these demand characteristics, okay, so these demand characteristics have a relation, and if you find any of these demand characteristics of high product margins, okay, high forecast errors, high stock out rates, high forced season end markdowns on prices, all these characteristics, demand characteristics, generally indicate to a condition of high implied uncertainty. Whereas lower margins, lower forecast errors, lower stock out rates, and lower forced season end markdown, price markdowns, they are indicative of a product having low demand, implied demand uncertainty. So to give you examples of how the demand characteristic is basically associated with implied level of implied demand uncertainty, we take the examples of two products, one having low implied demand uncertainty, another one having high implied demand uncertainty. Say for example, take the case of a product like table salt, okay, common salt which you use for cooking purposes. It is seen that the implied demand uncertainty is low for this particular product, and when you check the demand characteristics, okay, we see that these products are sold at low margins, okay, their demand forecasts are more accurate, the chances of these products going out of stock is generally very low, and they generally are not offered at price markdowns. Okay, so you generally do not see these products offered at any kinds of discounts at the very end. So as I told you, these characteristics of low margin, accurate demands, lower stock out rates, and nearly no price markdowns are indicative of a product that has low implied demand uncertainty. So if you find that these find any of these demand characteristics in a particular product, you can generally associate that product to be associated with low implied demand uncertainty. Whereas, take the example of a new mobile phone or a new communication device as such. Okay, so this is a case where you see high implied demand uncertainty because the demand characteristics are quite different. Okay, the demand characteristics are similar to the ones that you see for high implied demand uncertainty, where the margins for the products are very high. Okay, the demand forecasts are inaccurate. There will be high stock out rates if the product is successful, because if the product is very successful, then generally what happens is the forecast will be much lower than the actual demand. So generally that will result in stocking out of the products. Whereas if the product fails, there is a condition where the forecasts are greater than the demand. Okay, so in such a case, at the very end you might be forced to sell your products on large markdowns. Okay, so these are demand characteristics which are uh, reflective or indicative of a condition of high implied demand uncertainty, and that is what you see in the case of new mobile phone or new communication devices. So the demand characteristics, they are related to the level of implied demand uncertainty. So along with understanding the demand uncertainty, it is also important to consider the uncertainty that arises from the capability of a supply chain. Okay, so in a supply chain, the demand uncertainty is not the only factor that affects its supply chain uncertainty, but rather it is also important to consider the uncertainty that arises from the supplier's end, what we call as supply uncertainty. Okay, so take for example the case of new components being used in the manufacturing of a product by an automobile industry. Okay, so they are manufacturing a particular product that is already in existence, but for this particular product at the moment they are trying out new components. Okay, so these new components are being sourced from a particular supplier. Okay, they have the supplier has newly developed these components. So that is the case. So a particular product being manufactured by a manufacturer, okay, using newly developed components that are supplied by a particular supplier. So initially, since the supplier itself has developed that particular component newly, there will be a lot of issues with regard to quality. Okay, and there will be a lot of issues with regard to breakdown of the manufacturing plant of the supplier. Okay, since the product is new, quality issues and breakdown of the plant for that particular new component will be larger. Thus, the deliveries of these components, new components, to the manufacturer of the product, by the automobile industry, will be as per schedule will become much more difficult, resulting in higher levels of supply uncertainty. Okay, so the supplier is selling you products which are new. The chances of that particular firm that is buying the product from the supplier, okay, the chances of the particular the level of uncertainty faced in supply by the person or the firm buying that product from that supplier is generally very high. So high supplier uncertainty is faced in these cases, but as time progresses and as production technology and the production facility itself matures, the quality yields tend to improve and the breakdowns become less common. Okay, thus resulting in lower levels of supply uncertainty. So if a particular component used in a product is a new component, one that has been newly developed and manufactured, during this initial supply phase, we'll come across a high level of supply uncertainty due to quality and breakdown issues. Whereas as time progresses, the production technology and the plant itself matures, the quality yields tend to improve and the breakdowns become less common. So this basically makes the uncertainty in supply lower. Okay, and as indicated by the example above, it is very clear that the supply uncertainty is strongly affected by the life cycle position of the component. Okay, by the product I mean the component. So if a product that is being manufactured is basically using new or heavily modified if a product is new or heavily modified with new components, then the supply uncertainty will be high. Whereas for mature products which are longer into their product life cycle, the supply uncertainty will be low. So to understand the uncertainty faced by an entire supply chain, it is essential that you understand the uncertainty in demand as well as the uncertainty in supply. Okay, so because supply chain has uncertainties with respect to demand for the product that it will be placed by the customer, and it will have uncertainties with regard to supply of components from the suppliers. So to understand the entire uncertainty faced by the supply chain, we have to take these two uncertainties into consideration. Okay, so we have to combine these two uncertainties to determine the total uncertainty faced by the supply chain. So the entire uncertainty faced by a supply chain is made by or is quantified by combining the uncertainty in demand, specifically the implied demand uncertainty and the supply uncertainty. Okay, so the supply chain uncertainty as a whole is taken, or it is calculated, or it is basically quantified by combining the implied demand uncertainty and supply uncertainty together. So the total level of supply chain uncertainty may be indicated by using a spectral diagram which is referred to as the implied uncertainty spectrum. Okay, so in this particular spectrum we come across three categories based upon combination of demand and supply uncertainty, okay, which increases as we move towards the right. Okay, so the increased in the implied uncertainty faced by the supply chain increases as we move from the left towards the right along this particular spectrum, and in this particular spectrum we come across three different categories, okay, based upon a combination of demand and supply uncertainty. Okay, so on the left side we have a case where the demand and supply is generally much highly predictable, okay, or generally predictable demand and supply exists, and in such a case the implied uncertainty will be very low. Okay, so at the very left end of the spectrum you see a case of predictable demand and supply. So the total implied uncertainty, I'm talking about not demand uncertainty but the implied uncertainty faced by the entire supply chain due to predictable demand and predictable supply is generally very low. Okay, so that is an example for such a case is salt at a supermarket. Okay, the second case or the second category is where you see the demand being predictable and supply being uncertain, or a case where the supply is predictable and the demand being uncertain, or a case where there is somewhat uncertain demand and supply. So in essence, in this particular category, the level of implied uncertainty faced by the entire supply chain is moderate. Okay, it's not low, it's not high, but it's somewhere moderate, but it is greater than the one that is faced in the case where the demand and supply both are predictable. Okay, so examples for these kinds of firms are firms that deal with an existing automobile model and for agricultural products. So in the case of agricultural products like coffee and tea, okay, the demand is certain but the supply is uncertain. That is the case. That is because the supply of coffee and tea, the raw materials, tea leaves and coffee, okay, the coffee beans, they are unpredictable due to their they being influenced by weather conditions. So the supply is uncertain but the demand is predictable. Okay, an example where there we have predictable supply but uncertain demand is the case of an existing automobile. So an existing automobile is one that has been say on sale for quite a long time. So they have been manufactured for quite a long time. So the manufacturing process, so the production process itself is very mature. That's why the supply is basically very certain. Okay, whereas the demand can be uncertain. So the entire uncertainty faced by, when you combine these two together in terms of supply and demand uncertainty, the implied uncertainty faced by the entire supply chain will be somewhat moderate. And the third extreme case is the one at the extreme right, where we have highly uncertain supply as well as demand, resulting in high levels of implied uncertainty, supply chain implied uncertainty. Okay, so an example for such a case is a new mobile phone or a new communication device. So in the very first step, that is step number 1, we are basically trying to understand the customer needs, okay, understand the nature of supply, and basically by assessing the uncertainty in customer needs and uncertainty in supply, we will be able to understand what will be the uncertainty faced by the entire supply chain. Okay, and it is here in using this particular implied uncertainty spectrum that we determine what is the position of the firm based upon the products and the customers that we are serving. For example, I am responsible for a particular firm. Okay, I am dealing with a particular set of customers using a particular set of products. I am satisfying their needs by a particular product. So based upon the level of unpredictability in demand and supply, I will be clearly be able to identify where my firm lies. Okay, is my firm dealing with a certain set of products which where the implied uncertainty faced by the supply chain is moderate, low, or high? Okay, so I'll be able to clearly assess and identify what is a firm's position in the implied uncertainty spectrum. So the end result of step number 1 is basically assessment of the position of the firm in the implied uncertainty spectrum. Okay, so with this we conclude lecture number 7. Thank you.